The champagne flute shattered against the polished oak floor, silencing the laughter. Ethan's hand trembled, his heart pounding as every eye in the elegant barn-turned wedding venue locked onto him. He hadn't meant to drop it. Not yet. But the sight of Caleb, standing at the altar in a tailored tuxedo, had unraveled him completely. It was supposed to be the perfect day. Ethan's sister, Lily, radiant in her ivory gown, glowed with a joy that made the rolling hills of Vermont's countryside seem dim in comparison. The venue, a sprawling estate with fairy lights strung across weathered beams, buzzed with the warmth of family and friends. White roses adorned every table, their petals catching the golden light of late afternoon. Ethan, as the maid of honor's unofficial right-hand man, had spent months helping Lily plan this moment. He'd tasted cakes, folded napkins, and even learned to tie a bow tie for the occasion. But nothing could have prepared him for the gut punch of seeing Caleb, standing beside Lily, about to vow his life to her. 10 years ago, Ethan and Caleb had been inseparable. Two boys in a small New England town, sneaking kisses behind the old oak tree in Caleb's backyard, whispering dreams of a future they were too young to fully understand. They were 16, reckless, and in love, until Caleb's parents caught them. The fallout was brutal. Harsh words, slammed doors, and Caleb's sudden move to a boarding school across the country. Ethan had been left with nothing but a handwritten note. "I'll find you again. I promise." He'd clung to those words for years, searching for Caleb in every stranger's face, but time dulled the hope. Life moved on. Ethan built a career as a graphic designer in Boston, dated other men, and buried the ache of that first love. Until today. Caleb hadn't changed, not really. The same sharp jawline, the same hazel eyes that seemed to hold a secret only Ethan could read. But now, those eyes avoided him, fixed instead on Lily as she walked down the aisle. Ethan's chest tightened. How had this happened? How had Caleb, after a decade of silence, ended up engaged to his sister? The question burned as he stood frozen, glass shards at his feet, the crowd's murmurs growing louder. "Ethan, you okay?" Lily's best friend, Sarah, touched his arm, her voice low with concern. She was the only one who knew about Ethan's past with Caleb, a secret he'd shared one drunken night years ago. Her eyes darted to the altar, then back to him, wide with understanding. "I'm fine," Ethan lied, forcing a smile. He bent to pick up the broken glass, his fingers shaking. The band struck up a soft melody, signaling the start of the ceremony, and Ethan straightened, his gaze locked on Caleb. For a fleeting moment, Caleb looked back. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. A spark of recognition, of something unspoken, flickered between them. Then Caleb turned away, his shoulders stiff, and Ethan felt the air leave his lungs. The officiant began, her voice warm and practiced, but Ethan barely heard her. His mind spiraled back to that summer, to stolen moments in Caleb's attic, to promises made under a starlit sky. They'd planned to run away together after high school, to build a life where no one could tear them apart. But Caleb had vanished, and Ethan had spent years convincing himself it was just a teenage fling. Now, standing 10 feet from the man who'd once been his everything, he wasn't so sure. Lily's vows came first, her voice steady and full of love. "Caleb, you're my safe place," she said, her eyes shining. "You've shown me what it means to be truly seen." Ethan's stomach churned. Did she know? Had Caleb told her anything about their past? The thought made his pulse race. He glanced at Sarah, who was watching him like he might bolt at any moment. She wasn't wrong to worry. Caleb's turn came next. He cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting with the ring. "Lily," he began, his voice softer than Ethan remembered, "you've brought light into my life in ways I never thought possible." The words were beautiful, but they felt like daggers to Ethan. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. Caleb's gaze flickered toward him again, brief but deliberate, and Ethan's heart stuttered. Was it guilt? Regret? Or was Ethan imagining things, projecting his own unresolved feelings onto a man who'd clearly moved on? The officiant asked if anyone objected. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Ethan's throat tightened. He could feel Sarah's eyes boring into him, willing him to stay quiet. But the weight of 10 years, of love, loss, and unanswered questions, pressed harder. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching on the forgotten glass. "Ethan," Sarah hissed, grabbing his wrist. "Don't." He shook her off, his voice barely a whisper. "I have to." The crowd stirred, heads turning as Ethan raised his hand. Lily's smile faltered, her eyes searching his. Caleb's face drained of color, his lips parting as if to speak, but no words came. The officiant paused, her expression caught between confusion and curiosity. Ethan's voice cracked. He swallowed hard, his heart hammering so loud he was sure everyone could hear it. I need to say something. The barn seemed to hold its breath. Lily's hands dropped to her sides, the bouquet trembling. Caleb's eyes locked onto Ethan's, and for the first time that day, they didn't look away. There was no going back now. The air in the barn thickened, every whisper and rustle amplified in the stunned silence. Ethan stood frozen, his raised hand trembling as if it carried the weight of the truth he was about to unleash. Lily's eyes, wide with confusion, darted between him and Caleb, her bouquet now clutched tightly against her chest. Ethan, what are you doing? She asked, her voice small but sharp, cutting through the tension. The guests shifted in their seats, their murmurs rising like a tide. Ethan's throat felt like sandpaper, but he couldn't stop now. Not when Caleb's gaze held his, pleading and panicked, a mirror to the boy he'd loved a decade ago. I'm sorry, Lily, Ethan said, his voice steadier than he felt. But I can't let you marry him without knowing the truth. He took a deep breath, the words clawing their way out. Caleb and I, we were in love. 10 years ago, before he left, before everything changed. He was my first love. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Lily's face crumpled, her eyes flicking to Caleb, searching for a denial that didn't come. Caleb's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. For a moment, Ethan thought he might speak, might explain, but Caleb only stared at the floor, his silence louder than any words. Ethan, stop, Lily said, her voice breaking. This isn't funny. Why are you doing this? It's not a joke, Ethan said, his heart aching at the pain in her eyes. I didn't know he was your fiancé until I saw him today. I swear, Lily, I never meant to hurt you. He turned to Caleb, his voice dropping to a raw whisper. But you knew, didn't you? You knew who I was when you met her. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes blazing with a mix of guilt and defiance. Ethan, don't, he said, his voice low, almost a growl. But Ethan couldn't stop. Not now. Not when the truth was finally spilling out after years of being buried. Don't what? Ethan shot back, stepping closer to the altar. Don't tell her how we promised each other forever, how you left without a word, or how you're standing here now, about to marry my sister, like none of it ever happened. The guests were no longer whispering. They were openly staring, some with shock, others with pity. Sarah stepped forward, her hand on Ethan's arm again, but he shrugged her off. Lily's face was a mask of betrayal, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Caleb, she said, her voice trembling, is this true? Caleb opened his mouth, then closed it, his shoulders slumping. It was a long time ago, he said finally, his voice barely audible. We were kids, Lily. It didn't mean. Don't you dare say it didn't mean anything. Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. You don't get to erase it. You don't get to pretend it wasn't real. His chest heaved, the memories flooding back, late nights sneaking into each other's rooms, the warmth of Caleb's hand in his, the way they'd laughed until dawn. It had been everything to him. Lily turned to Caleb, her voice sharp now. You knew he was my brother, and you didn't tell me? Not once. She took a step back, her bouquet falling to the floor, petals scattering like confetti gone wrong. What else are you hiding? I didn't want to hurt you, Caleb said, his voice cracking. I thought I could move on, that I could be what you needed. Ethan's heart twisted. Move on. The words stung, but they also sparked a flicker of hope. Did Caleb still feel something? Was that why he couldn't meet Ethan's eyes for more than a second? The thought was dangerous, but it burned all the same. The officiant cleared her throat, clearly out of her depth. Perhaps we should take a moment, she began, but Lily cut her off. No, she said, her voice firm despite the tears streaming down her face. I need to know everything. Now. She looked at Ethan, her expression a mix of anger and desperation. Tell me. Ethan hesitated. This wasn't how he'd imagined this moment. Not in front of 100 strangers, not with his sister's heart breaking in real time. But there was no turning back. He told her about the summer of their teenage years, about the love that had felt invincible until it wasn't. He told her about Caleb's parents, their fury, and the way they'd ripped Caleb away without warning. He told her about the note, the one he still kept in a box under his bed, its edges worn from years of rereading. By the time he finished, the barn was silent again. Lily's face was unreadable, her hands trembling as she wiped her tears. Caleb hadn't moved, his eyes fixed on the floor, his silence a confession in itself. The guests were a blur of shocked faces, but Ethan didn't care about them. He cared about Lily, about the truth, and, despite everything, about Caleb. I'm so sorry, Ethan said to Lily, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't want it to happen like this. But you deserve to know who you're marrying. Lily nodded slowly, Her lips pressed into a thin line. "I need time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned and walked out of the barn, her dress trailing behind her, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. Caleb finally looked at Ethan, his eyes raw with something Ethan couldn't quite name. Regret, maybe, or something deeper. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low. "And you shouldn't have lied," Ethan replied, his own voice shaking. "To her. To yourself." The crowd began to stir, some guests standing, others whispering furiously. Sarah tugged at Ethan's sleeve, urging him to follow her outside, but he couldn't move. Not yet. Not when Caleb was still standing there, looking at him like the world was falling apart. The evening air was cool against Ethan's skin as he stepped outside, the fairy lights casting a soft glow over the Vermont hillside. The barn's warmth and chaos felt miles away, replaced by the quiet hum of crickets and the distant murmur of guests still processing the bombshell he dropped. Ethan's legs felt unsteady, his heart still racing from the weight of his words. Lily was nowhere in sight. Sarah had gone after her, promising to check the bridal suite, but Ethan needed a moment to breathe, to make sense of what he'd just done. He wandered toward the edge of the venue, where a wooden bench overlooked a field of wildflowers. The sky was turning indigo, the first stars peeking through, and for a moment he could almost pretend he was 16 again, sitting with Caleb under a similar sky, dreaming of a world that didn't judge them. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind him. Ethan didn't need to turn to know it was Caleb. The air shifted, charged with the weight of their shared history. Caleb stopped a few feet away, his silhouette sharp against the fading light. "Why now?" Caleb asked, his voice low, strained. "Why today, Ethan?" Ethan turned, his eyes narrowing. "You're really asking me that? You're marrying my sister, Caleb. My sister. And you didn't think to mention that we—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. "You didn't think I deserved to know?" Caleb ran a hand through his hair, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, tie loosened. He looked less like a groom and more like the boy Ethan remembered, vulnerable, uncertain. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. "When I met Lily, I didn't even know she was your sister. Not at first. And by the time I realized—" "You realized, and you still didn't say anything." Ethan finished, his voice sharp. "You let me walk into this wedding blind. You let me stand there, watching you promise your life to her, knowing what we were." Caleb flinched, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I thought I could leave it behind," he said quietly. "I thought I could be normal. For her. For myself. Normal." Ethan's laugh was bitter, cutting through the night air. "Is that what you call this? Lying to everyone, including yourself? You think that's normal?" Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes flashing. "You don't get it, Ethan. You never had to. You were out, proud, living your truth in Boston. I was the one who got sent away, who had to rebuild everything from scratch. My parents." His voice broke, and he looked away, his jaw tight. "They made it clear what I'd lose if I didn't change." Ethan's anger faltered, replaced by a pang of sympathy he didn't want to feel. He remembered the stories Caleb had told him back then, about his father's cold disapproval, his mother's tears. But sympathy didn't erase the hurt. "So you changed," Ethan said softly. "You chose to hide, and now Lily's paying for it." Caleb's shoulders slumped, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I love her," he said, but the words sounded hollow, like a line he'd rehearsed too many times. "I do. She's good, Ethan. She's kind, and she deserves better than this." "Then why didn't you tell her?" Ethan asked, stepping closer. "Why didn't you tell her about us?" "Because I was scared," Caleb admitted, his voice barely audible. "Scared of losing her. Scared of facing you. Scared of what it means that I still—" He stopped, his breath hitching. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Still what?" he pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb looked at him then, his eyes raw, unguarded. "You know what?" he said, and the words hung between them, heavy with meaning. For a moment, neither spoke. The wildflowers swayed in the breeze, the stars growing brighter overhead. Ethan wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap between them, but the weight of Lily's pain held him back. "You can't have it both ways," he said finally. "You can't love her and still feel whatever this is." Caleb's face crumpled, and for the first time, Ethan saw the cracks in the man he'd become, the man who tried to bury his past under a perfect life. "I don't know how to fix this," Caleb said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how to make it right." Before Ethan could respond, Sarah's voice cut through the darkness. "Ethan!" She was running toward them, her face pale. "It's Lily. She's leaving." Ethan's stomach dropped. He turned to Caleb, who looked as if he'd been struck. "Go," Ethan said, his voice firm. "Talk to her. Be honest for once." Caleb hesitated, then nodded, sprinting toward the parking lot where Lily's car was pulling away. Ethan watched him go, his heart torn between anger and a longing he couldn't shake. He sank onto the bench, his head in his hands, the weight of the night pressing down on him. When Sarah reached him, she didn't say anything, just sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. Did I ruin everything? Ethan asked, his voice muffled. You told the truth, Sarah said softly. That's not the same thing. But as the stars blinked above, Ethan wasn't so sure. The gravel crunched under Caleb's shoes as he sprinted toward the parking lot, his breath ragged. Lily's car was already halfway down the drive, its taillights glowing red in the dusk. Lily, he shouted, his voice hoarse, desperate. The car slowed, then stopped, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might listen. She stepped out, her wedding dress catching the moonlight, her face streaked with mascara. What do you want, Caleb? She asked, her voice flat, drained of the warmth he'd always known. To tell me it's all a misunderstanding? That my brother's lying? Caleb stopped a few feet away, his hands raised as if to calm her, but he had no words to fix this. I'm sorry, he said, the words spilling out inadequate. I should have told you. I wanted to, but you didn't. Lily cut in, her voice sharp. You let me fall in love with you, plan a life with you, and you never thought to mention that you and Ethan. She trailed off, her hand shaking. How could you do this to me? Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to tell her it wasn't intentional, that he'd never meant to hurt her, but the truth was messy. He'd met Lily at a charity event in Boston, her laugh drawing him in, her kindness anchoring him. He hadn't known she was Ethan's sister, not until months later, when she'd shown him a photo of her family. By then, he was already in too deep, too afraid to lose her, too afraid to face the past he'd buried. I thought I could be the man you deserved, he said, his voice breaking. I thought I could leave it all behind. Ethan, the past, everything. Lily's eyes flashed with anger. Leave it behind? Caleb, you don't get to erase someone's heart like that. Not Ethan's. Not mine. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do you still love him? The question hit like a punch. Caleb's mind raced. Images of Ethan flooding back, his smile, his touch, the way he'd made Caleb feel alive in a way he hadn't since. But he also saw Lily, her strength, her trust, now shattered because of him. I don't know, he admitted, his voice barely audible. I thought I didn't, but seeing him today. Lily's face crumpled, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. I can't do this, she said, her voice muffled. I can't marry someone who's not sure. She got back in the car, the door slamming shut, and drove off, leaving Caleb alone in the dust. Back at the venue, Ethan sat with Sarah, the night air growing colder. The guests had mostly dispersed, some leaving awkwardly, others lingering in hushed conversations. Ethan's phone buzzed with texts from relatives, but he ignored them. His mind was on Lily and Caleb. He went after her, Sarah said, breaking the silence. What happens now? Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy. I don't know. I didn't want to hurt her, Sarah. I couldn't let her marry him without knowing. Sarah nodded, her hand resting on his. You did the right thing, but it's not over yet. You and Caleb, there's still something there, isn't there? Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to deny it, to say he'd moved on, but the truth was undeniable. Seeing Caleb had reopened every wound, every hope he'd thought was gone. It doesn't matter, he said finally. Lily's what matters now. But as the night wore on, Ethan couldn't shake the image of Caleb's eyes, the way they'd looked at him. Like maybe, just maybe, some promises weren't as broken as they seemed. The next morning, the venue was quiet, the fairy lights dimmed, the roses wilting. Ethan sat at a table in the empty barn, a cold coffee in his hands, replaying the night before. Lily hadn't returned his calls, and Caleb had vanished after chasing her car. The weight of what he'd done, disrupting his sister's wedding, exposing a past that wasn't justice to tell, pressed down on him. Sarah found him there, her face tired but determined. Lily's at her apartment in town, she said. She wants to see you. Ethan's stomach nodded, but he nodded. And Caleb? Sarah hesitated. He's there too. The drive to Lily's apartment was a blur of Vermont's green hills, Ethan's mind racing with what he'd say. When he arrived, Lily opened the door, her eyes red but calm. Caleb stood behind her, his face drawn, his tuxedo replaced by a plain sweater and jeans. The sight of them together, even now, twisted something in Ethan's chest. Sit, Lily said, gesturing to the couch. Her voice was steady, but her hands fidgeted with the tissue. Ethan sat, his eyes flicking to Caleb, who wouldn't meet his gaze. I talked to Caleb all night, Lily began, her voice soft but firm. He told me everything, about you too, about what happened after he left. I'm not going to lie, Ethan. It hurts. It hurts more than I can say. She paused, her eyes glistening. But I'm not angry at you. You were honest, even when it was hard. Ethan's throat tightened. I'm so sorry, Lily. I didn't want to ruin your day. You didn't ruin it, she said, a sad smile tugging at her lips. You saved me from a marriage built on secrets. She glanced at Caleb, who looked down, his hands clasped tightly. Caleb and I are done. Not because of you, but because he wasn't honest with me or himself. Caleb's head snapped up, his eyes wet. Lily, No, she said gently, cutting him off. You need to figure out who you are, Caleb. And you can't do that with me. She turned to Ethan, her expression softening. And you need to stop carrying this alone. You've been holding on to him for 10 years. It's time to let go, or fight for it. Ethan's heart pounded. He looked at Caleb, who finally met his gaze, his eyes raw with regret and something else. Hope. Maybe. I don't know if I can, Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily stood, squeezing his shoulder. You'll figure it out. Both of you. She walked out, leaving Ethan and Caleb alone. The silence was deafening. Caleb spoke first, his voice shaky. I never stopped thinking about you, he said. Even when I tried to, even when I convinced myself I could be someone else. Ethan's chest ached. Then why didn't you come back? Why didn't you fight for us? I was scared, Caleb admitted, his voice breaking. I thought I'd lose everything, my family, my life. But I lost you instead. And now I've lost Lily too. Ethan stood, his emotions a tangled mess. You don't get to just say that and expect it to fix everything, he said, his voice trembling. But I don't want to lose you again, either. Caleb stepped closer, his hand reaching out, then stopping. Can we try? He asked, his voice barely audible. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. Ethan looked into Caleb's eyes, seeing the boy he'd loved and the man he still did, despite everything. Someday, he said, a tentative promise. They didn't touch, didn't rush to close the gap. But as Ethan left the apartment, the weight in his chest felt lighter, replaced by a fragile hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could face it. Not alone, but with the possibility of something real, something worth fighting for.